The Wyoming wind, sharp as a hunter's knife, whipped around Alara as she pushed her plow through the stubborn earth. It was 1885, and the world was a hard place, especially for a woman alone. Alara was not just any woman. She was a giant of a woman, taller than most men and strong as an ox. Her hands, rough from work, gripped the plow handles with a power that few could match. Her husband, Thomas, had passed away with the spring thaw, leaving her with their small farm and a heavy heart. Now, under the vast, endless sky, Alara was doing the work of two men. Each furrow she carved into the field was a testament to her will, a silent promise to keep Thomas's dream alive. Sweat beaded on her brow, mixing with the dust that clung to her dark, braided hair. The sun beat down, hot and unforgiving, but Alara did not falter. She wore simple, faded clothes that couldn't hide her broad shoulders and long limbs. Her face, usually set in a determined line, held a trace of sadness, a quiet ache that no amount of plowing could chase away. From the distant town, you could hear the faint sounds of life, but here, on her lonely patch of land, only the creak of the plow and her own heavy breathing broke the silence. The neighbors, if they dared to pass by, would quicken their pace, casting sideways glances at the tall figure in the field. They whispered behind cupped hands, their words carried on the wind like dry leaves. Alara knew what they said. She always had. But she pushed it all away, focusing instead on the rich, dark soil turning over beneath her feet. This land was hers, and she would tend to it, no matter how much her body ached or how much her heart felt like a stone in her chest. The sun climbed higher, baking the land and making the air shimmer. Alara kept working, her movements steady and strong. Plowing was only the start. When the sun began to dip, painting the sky in fiery colors, she unhitched the horse, patting its neck with a calloused hand. The animal, tired but well cared for, headed to the small barn. Alara followed, not to rest, but to fetch the heavy buckets. Fetching water was another chore that demanded her strength. The well was deep, and the buckets, when full, were heavy enough to make most folks groan. But Alara lifted them with a practiced ease, carrying them to the small garden she also tended. Tomatoes, beans, and corn grew there, watered by her efforts. She knelt, her large hands gentle as she checked the young plants, pulling out stubborn weeds that tried to steal their nourishment. Inside the small, one-room cabin, more work awaited. The fire needed tending, a simple meal cooked, and a few clothes washed. She moved with purpose, her tall frame filling the small space. There was no one to help her chop firewood, no one to mend the roof when a shingle blew loose in a storm. She did it all. She had learned to fix the fence when the wind tore it down and to pull the calf when it struggled to be born. Her days were a long string of tasks, from sunup to sundown, each one requiring her muscles and her will. Every evening, as the stars began to sprinkle across the dark canvas of the sky, Alara would sit by the dying fire, her body weary, but her spirit unbroken. She managed everything, a silent powerhouse against the wild Wyoming world. Even though Alara kept to her farm, the whispers of the townsfolk found their way to her, carried on the very wind that rustled her crops. Whenever she had to ride into town for supplies, nails, flour, a new plowshare, the air in the general store would grow thick with unspoken words. Children, taught by their elders, would sometimes point, their mothers quickly pulling them away, but not before a smirk or a knowing glance was shared. Mrs. Gable, with her pinched face and sharp tongue, was often the ringleader. "Look at her," she'd hiss to Mrs. Peterson, barely bothering to lower her voice. "A woman built like a barn. What man would ever want that?" Mrs. Peterson would nod, her eyes wide with false pity, though a cruel smile would play on her lips. They called her Big Alara or Alara the Giant, in hushed tones, never to her face, of course. They saw her strength not as something to admire, but as something unnatural, something that made her different and therefore wrong. They made fun of how she walked, how she carried heavy sacks of grain as if they were feathers, how she wore plain, strong boots instead of pretty shoes. They talked about her husband, Thomas, saying he must have been a fool to marry such a creature. The fact that she was alone, a widow fending for herself, seemed to feed their gossip even more. It was as if her independence, born of necessity, was an insult to their way of life. Alara would hear snippets of their cruel words, feel their eyes on her back, but she would simply tighten her grip on her basket, pay for her goods, and leave, her head held high. Each whisper was like a tiny stone thrown at her, but she had learned to build a wall around her heart, hoping it would keep the hurt at bay. The sharpest stings from the townsfolk weren't about her strength or her hard work, but about her future, or rather, what they believed was her lack of one. Poor thing, one woman would cluck. Who would ever take on a woman like that? She's built for a man's work, not a man's heart. Another would chime in, she's too much for any man, that one. Too tall, too strong. She'd scare them off. These words, though often said just out of earshot, still found their mark. Alara had always been big, even as a girl, and she had grown used to the way people looked at her. But the thought that her size made her unworthy of love, that it meant she was destined to be alone forever, was a cold, bitter pill to swallow. After Thomas, her heart felt like a fragile thing, easily bruised, and their comments only added to the ache. "She'll die an old maid," Mrs. Gable declared one afternoon at the well, her voice carrying across the dusty road. "No man wants a wife who can outlift him. They want a soft touch, someone delicate to care for." A group of younger women giggled, their eyes darting towards Alara's distant farm. The idea that a woman should be small and dainty was deeply rooted in their minds, and Alara, with her broad shoulders and powerful stride, simply didn't fit. They believed her strength, which kept her farm alive, was actually her biggest fault, making her undesirable. These cruel predictions echoed in the quiet corners of Alara's mind, especially on long, lonely evenings. They made her wonder if the townsfolk were right, if her life would indeed be spent in solitude, forever tending to her land without a partner by her side. While the townsfolk whispered their unkind words, not everyone saw Alara through such narrow eyes. On a small farm a few miles away, tucked behind a ridge of hills, lived Silas. He was a quiet man, with kind eyes that often seemed to hold a faraway look, like he was thinking of things beyond the dusty horizon. Silas didn't have much, his land was tough, and his crops often struggled, but he had a good heart and a thoughtful mind. From his own fields, sometimes he could see Alara working. She was just a distant shape at first, then a clear figure against the vast sky. He watched her strong, steady movements, the way she handled the plow with a natural grace despite its weight. He saw her leading the horse, tending to her garden, and even fixing a broken fence post with her own hands. While others sneered at her strength, Silas felt a different kind of feeling bloom in his chest. It wasn't pity, and it certainly wasn't scorn. Silas saw not a giant woman or an old maid, but a hard-working soul. He saw courage in her solitary efforts, a spirit that refused to break. He often wondered about her, about the burdens she carried, and the quiet strength she held within. He imagined her hands, rough from toil, yet capable of tenderness. Unlike the townsfolk, who judged her by what she appeared to be, Silas admired her for what she truly was, a woman of remarkable strength and endurance, facing the world alone with unwavering resolve. He felt a gentle pull towards her, a respect that grew with each passing day as he watched her fight to keep her farm alive. Silas's own farm was a tough mistress, demanding long hours and often giving little back. He knew the bite of the wind and the ache in weary muscles. So, when he watched Alara, he didn't see a woman who was too much or unnatural. He saw a kindred spirit, someone who understood the silent battle against the land. He saw how she coaxed life from the soil, how she faced each dawn with grit and determination, never once shrinking from the enormity of her tasks. He'd seen her struggle with a stubborn rock caught in her plow, wrestling it free with a grunt, her brow furrowed in concentration. He'd seen her mend a broken fence with practiced hands, hammering nails with a strength that would put many men to shame. While others in town spoke of her as if she were a beast of burden, Silas saw the quiet grace in her movements, the gentle way she led her horse, the careful touch she used when tending her garden. He knew the whispers, of course. He'd heard Mrs. Gable and her cronies at the general store, their cruel words about Alara being too big, too strong, too much for any man. But Silas simply shook his head. He didn't care for small, dainty hands. He cared for hands that could build a life, that could work hard, that could offer comfort. He didn't care for a woman who needed saving. He admired a woman who saved herself, day after day. Her strength wasn't a fault to him. It was a beacon, a quiet testament to her unwavering spirit. In his eyes, Alara was not an object of ridicule, but a woman of deep, admirable power, both in body and in heart. He saw her as a true partner, someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with him against the wildness of Wyoming. The admiration that had grown in Silas's heart for Alara became too big to keep to himself. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow dip behind the western hills, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, Silas made a decision. He had watched Alara finish her daily chores, seeing the last wisps of smoke curl from her chimney, a sign that her long day was drawing to a close. His own supper lay untouched on his table. Taking a deep breath, Silas squared his shoulders. His heart beat a little faster than usual, a nervous drum in his chest. He was not a man of many words, and the thought of approaching Alara, a woman he respected so deeply, filled him with a quiet tremor. But the idea of leaving her to face her burdens alone, knowing what the townsfolk said, felt worse. He walked past his own fields, now quiet and still, and started down the dusty track that led toward Alara's farm. The distance seemed longer than usual, each step a testament to his rising courage. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of sagebrush and damp earth. As he drew closer, he could make out the silhouette of her small cabin, a single lamp glowing softly in its window. His boots crunched on the gravel, the only sound in the growing dusk. He wondered what he would say, how she would react to a stranger at her door. His hands felt clumsy, and he wiped them on his worn trousers. He was just a simple farmer, with little to offer but his respect and a willing heart. Still, he kept walking, drawn by a feeling stronger than his shyness, towards the brave, solitary woman he had come to admire so much. Alara was stirring the last embers of her cooking fire when a soft knock sounded at her cabin door. She rarely had visitors, and her hand instinctively went to the heavy iron poker by the hearth. Opening the door slowly, she saw Silas standing there, hat in hand, his gaze steady but gentle. He was a man she had seen from afar, a quiet farmer known for his honest dealings. "Evening, ma'am," Silas said, his voice low and calm, like the rustle of leaves. He didn't stare at her height or her sturdy build, nor did his eyes hold any of the pity or judgment she was used to seeing. Instead, he looked at her face, at her tired but clear eyes. "My name's Silas. I live a few miles yonder." He gestured vaguely with his hat. Alara simply nodded, her expression guarded. She waited, expecting him to ask for help, or perhaps to offer some unwanted advice, or even worse, to echo the townsfolk's cruel words. But Silas did none of those things. "I've watched you," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "working your land, day in and day out, since Thomas passed. It takes a remarkable spirit to face all that alone." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The land here is unforgiving, and life can be harder still. But you, Alara, you meet it with a strength of heart I've rarely seen." He spoke of her spirit, her courage, her unyielding will. Not a single word about her size, her muscles, or the heavy work she did. He saw beyond the surface, directly to the core of who she was. Alara felt a strange warmth spread through her, a feeling she hadn't known in a long time. It was the warmth of true respect, offered without expectation or judgment. Alara's gaze, which had been wary, softened slightly as Silas spoke. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not about her spirit. She listened intently as he continued, his voice earnest and kind. "I know what folks say about you," Silas admitted, his eyes holding a hint of sadness. "About your hands, your strength. They talk as if those things are a burden. But I see them as a testament to who you are. And let me be clear, Elara. He took a small step closer, his voice growing a little stronger. I don't need your strong arms to help me plow my fields or lift heavy stones. Elara blinked, surprised by his directness. She waited for the real reason he was there, for the pity or the joke. But never came. Silas looked straight into her eyes, his own reflecting a deep sincerity. My fields are tough, and I manage them well enough on my own. I have my own strength for that. What I need, Elara, he said, his voice dropping to a gentle whisper that was nonetheless clear, what I truly need, is your heart. A kind heart, a brave heart like yours. The words hung in the quiet evening air, soft yet powerful. They were unlike anything Elara had ever heard. He wasn't asking for her labor. He wasn't asking for her to be someone she wasn't. He was asking for her, the woman behind the strength, the woman whose heart carried the weight of her loneliness and the warmth of her quiet resilience. It was a plea for companionship, for love, for a shared life, all centered not on what she could do, but on who she was. Elara felt a tear prick the corner of her eye, a feeling she quickly tried to hide. No one had ever seen past her strength to her heart before. The tear that had pricked Elara's eye was quickly blinked away, but the feeling it represented lingered. Surprise, like a gentle hand, touched her heart. For so long, she had braced herself against unkindness, against pity, against the cruel jokes that chipped away at her spirit. She had built walls around her feelings, making herself hard and unyielding, much like the land she worked. But Silas's words were different. They didn't seek to break down her walls. They simply walked around them, finding the tender spot she had guarded so fiercely. He didn't see her as a problem to be solved or a curiosity to be gawked at. He saw her, the loneliness that had been a constant companion since Thomas's death. A heavy cloak draped over her shoulders began to lift just a little. A small, unfamiliar flutter started in her chest. It wasn't the ache of sadness or the sting of being alone. It was something lighter, warmer. It was hope. Hope that perhaps the townsfolk were wrong. Hope that her life wasn't destined to be a solitary march through endless fields. Hope that someone finally saw past her outward appearance to the woman within. Elara found her voice, a little rusty from disuse in personal matters. My heart?" she asked, the words barely a whisper. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken of her heart with such tenderness. Silas nodded, his kind eyes unwavering. In that moment, the vast, empty future she had imagined for herself began to shimmer, revealing a new path, one filled with the soft glow of possibility. The heavy burden of her sadness seemed to lighten, replaced by a fragile, yet undeniable, sense of a future that might not be so lonely after all. After that first brave conversation, a quiet rhythm began to form between Elara and Silas. He started visiting her in the evenings, sometimes just sitting on her small porch as the sun went down, talking about the weather, the crops, and the silent vastness of the Wyoming sky. Elara, who had grown used to the quiet solitude, found herself looking forward to his visits. They would share simple meals, Elara often making a stew from her garden vegetables, and Silas bringing fresh bread from his own baking. They talked about their dreams for their farms, the challenges they faced, and the small joys they found in the hard work. Silas never tried to offer help with her heavy chores, respecting her independence, but he would often mend a broken tool or tighten a loose hinge on her barn door without being asked. Elara learned that Silas had a gentle humor, a quiet way of making her smile, a feeling she hadn't felt in years. He listened with true interest to her thoughts and worries, something Thomas, busy as he was, hadn't always done. She, in turn, found herself opening up, sharing stories of her childhood, of her love for the land, and even the pangs of loneliness that had burdened her. Silas admired her strength, but he also saw her tenderness, the way she carefully nurtured her plants, or how she spoke softly to her horse. He discovered that beneath her tough exterior was a heart yearning for connection. They found comfort in each other's quiet presence, a sense of belonging that grew stronger with each shared sunset. What started as admiration for her spirit slowly blossomed into a deep fondness, a gentle love growing between two solitary souls against the wide, open plains. Each day, the empty space in Alara's heart felt a little less empty. As Alara and Silas's connection deepened, it wasn't long before the townsfolk started to notice. Silas, a man who usually kept to himself, began joining Alara on her trips to the general store. He would walk beside her, his presence a quiet shield against the usual stares and whispers. At first, there was stunned silence. Mrs. Gable, caught in mid-gossip, would stop dead, her mouth hanging open like a fish. The sight of Silas, a respected if quiet farmer, by Alara's side was something entirely unexpected. They would see him helping her unload sacks of feed from her wagon, or simply standing close by as she paid for her goods. Their eyes would dart from Alara's tall figure to Silas's gentle face, trying to make sense of it. The mocking murmurs began to falter, replaced by confused glances. "Well, I never—" "Mrs. Peterson," would gasp to her neighbor. "Silas?" "With her." The younger women, who once giggled, now simply stared, a mix of curiosity and surprise on their faces. The idea that big Alara could attract such a kind man was completely against everything they had said. Slowly, the cruel jokes about her being too much for any man started to die down. It was hard to mock someone when they were clearly cherished. The townsfolk still looked, but their looks changed. There was less scorn, more bewildered observation. Silas's quiet acceptance of Alara, his clear affection, began to chip away at the harsh judgments that had surrounded her for so long. The ridicule didn't vanish overnight, but sharp edges softened, losing its power to wound as Alara walked taller, no longer quite so alone. One crisp autumn evening, as the last of the harvest moon cast long shadows across Alara's fields, Silas came to her with a look of quiet purpose. They sat on her porch, the familiar creak of the wood a comforting sound between them. The wind whispered through the tall grass, but there was no awkward silence, only the easy calm of two souls who had found their way to each other. Silas took Alara's hand, his touch warm and firm. "Alara," he began, his voice a little shaky but clear, "my life was good enough before you, but now it feels like it could be so much more. You brought a light to my days that I didn't know I was missing." He paused, looking into her eyes, which now held less sorrow and more warmth. "I want to share my life with you. My farm, my home, my heart. Will you marry me?" Alara's breath caught in her throat. The question, simple and honest, filled the space between them. For so long, the idea of marriage had been a distant, painful memory or a cruel joke from others. Now, it was a promise, a heartfelt offering from a man who saw her for who she truly was. A gentle smile, one that reached her eyes, spread across her face. "Yes, Silas," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Yes, I will." Their decision was not made with grand gestures or loud pronouncements, but with a quiet understanding and a deep, shared sense of belonging. It was a commitment born of mutual respect, growing admiration, and a love that had blossomed in the harsh, beautiful landscape of Wyoming. They would face the world together, two independent spirits choosing to walk as one. Their future, once shadowed by loneliness and unkind words, now gleamed with the promise of shared warmth and unwavering partnership. The wedding was a simple affair, held in Alara's small cabin, smelling faintly of pine and wood smoke. There were no fancy decorations, no big feast, just a few close friends, mostly those who had always treated Alara with kindness, or at least with quiet respect. The justice of the peace from town, a kindly old man who had known Thomas, performed the ceremony. Alara wore her best dress, a plain but well-made dark blue fabric, softened by a simple white lace collar she had stitched herself. Silas stood beside her, his hand warm and steady in hers. He wore his Sunday best, a clean, pressed shirt, and his eyes held a joyful light that Alara had never seen before. As they spoke their vows, promising to love and honor each other, the air in the small room felt thick with a quiet, deep happiness. For Alara, it wasn't just a marriage. It was a moment of profound dignity. Standing there, not as big Alara or Alara the giant, but simply as Alara, the woman Silas loved and chose to stand beside, she felt a peace she hadn't known since Thomas's passing. The whispers of the townsfolk, the cruel jokes about her being too much for any man, seemed to fade into nothingness. Here, in Silas's steady gaze, she was simply his wife, cherished and wanted for her heart, not for her strength. A small, genuine smile lit her face, a smile that reached her eyes and banished the last shadows of loneliness. She was no longer just a widow plowing fields alone. She was a partner, a beloved, a wife. And in that moment, she felt completely, truly happy. Their union was a quiet triumph, a testament to a love that saw beyond outward appearances, finding beauty and worth in the heart. The seasons turned, and Alara and Silas settled into their new life together. Their two small farms, once separate and lonely, now worked as one. Silas would often be seen plowing his fields, with Alara working alongside him in hers. Or sometimes they would share a plow, one guiding the horse, the other steadying the handles. Her strength was still there, but now it was a shared effort, a dance of partnership rather than a solitary struggle. They built a small addition to Alara's cabin, making room for their shared life. In the evenings, the light from their window shone brighter, a beacon of warmth and companionship. They ate their meals together, planned their crops, and simply enjoyed the quiet comfort of being with someone who truly understood. Alara's laughter, once a rare sound, became more common, a joyful melody carried on the wind. The townsfolk, who had once mocked, now watched with a different kind of gaze. When Alara and Silas rode into town, hand in hand, no one whispered or pointed. Mrs. Gable might still try to cluck, but her words held no power, and no one truly listened anymore. Instead, they saw a couple, strong and united, making a life together against the rugged Wyoming land. They saw respect in Silas's eyes for his wife, and they saw a deep happiness in Alara's face. The ridicule had given way to a quiet admiration, a recognition that love had found its way to Alara, not in spite of who she was, but because of it. Alara, no longer just a giant widow, but Silas's beloved wife, found not only happiness, but a profound sense of dignity. She had always been strong, but now she was also loved, and that made all the difference in the world. Together, they stood as a testament that true hearts find each other, no matter what others say.